On this edition of FedGov Today with Francis Rose, a contracting shift that's finally taking hold across government.
A greater openness to the idea that maybe companies, whether they're traditional government contractors or innovative outsiders, maybe they have an idea of how we can do work better and we ought to listen to them.
David Berteau on FedGov Today in just a moment. First, though, the end of the shutdown, when it comes, will mean agencies can start contracting at full speed again. But that may take some time after the longest federal government shutdown in history. Mike Darios, the outgoing Deputy Assistant Secretary for Acquisition at the State Department, will tell you what to expect on the new FedGov Today TV. You can watch the show on the FedGov Today YouTube channel anytime, and it's available on our website at fedgovtoday.com. You've heard on this program over the last week or so how the landscape will look different for the federal government for the reopening after the shutdown. The landscape could look a lot different for the contractors government works with, too. David Berteau is an independent consultant. He's former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Materiel Readiness at the Department of Defense. David, welcome. It's great to see you again. How will the landscape look different, both for the person in government who interfaces with a contractor and for that contractor and the company that person works for? Welcome, David.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you so much for having me. It's going to be a very different world for contractors going back. And there's really two sets of experiences that we've had here. Those that were affected by that long partial government shutdown, Christmas 2018 through the end of January, will have, just 7 years ago or 6 years ago that they went through this. And so for them, it'll be more familiar territory. Those that work for those cabinet departments that were not affected and haven't actually shut down since 2013, almost nobody is in the position they're in now and were in the same position then. So everybody's coming from a different perspective. I think the first and most important thing to recognize is that a lot of things will have happened to your customer while they were out, right? The RIF notices that went out, the questions of what money goes where to be spent, even the question of how long is the CR. If it really does only last through November 21st, you've only got three weeks. You may have 7 weeks worth of money, but you've only got 3 weeks worth of life for that money, right? And so there's a huge, big set of questions that we don't know the answers to. You ought to be looking at those questions right now. But I think the most important thing for every contractor to recognize is that on day one, when the government reopens, more than likely, you as the contractor are not going to be the top of mind for the government officials coming back to their desk. Remember what happened in 2019? The PIV cards had expired because nobody had used them for 30 days, and it took a day and a half for people to even get their cards reissued and back in. Now, maybe they're smarter this time. Maybe they like that. I don't know. We'll see how that plays out. So be ready for delays to extend even beyond day one of reopening. So that's important.
The priority that agencies set, will that entirely dictate the way that contractors should respond to that? Or are there things that the companies and the teams that work with government people should be doing now to prepare for when the doors reopen, David?
Shift in the last few months across the federal government with the idea that the government decides what to do and then the contractors respond, with a proposal, and ultimately they win the contract and they perform the work. The shift that we've seen is a greater openness to the idea that maybe companies, whether they're traditional government contractors or innovative outsiders, maybe they have an idea of how we can do work better and we ought to listen to them. And you're starting to see a crack in that wall that's opened up in a number of agencies. You've seen a lot of that in GSA. It's inherent in most of the FAR overhaul that's been released so far and in the guidance documents that come from that. Now, that doesn't mean that companies should take advantage of that or expect it to happen on day one, but it's a mentality, I think, that's a little bit different than you've done for your typical recovery after a contract. But two things with respect to just coming back to work. Number one is, at PSC, I was at the Professional Services Council, as you know, during that last shutdown, 2018, 2019. We did an extensive amount of discussions with those agencies that were affected by the shutdown. And what we found, and this is anecdotal because nobody really had reportable public data, but what we found that on average, in fact, almost across the board, it took between 3 and 5 days for every day the government was closed, including weekends, 3 to 5 extra days to get back to where you would have been had it not shut down at all. So companies should expect that it could take that amount of time to get back. And what do I mean by getting back? Open bids that were out there, solicitations that have been submitted but contracts not yet awarded, all that's going to be reassessed. We're lucky in that this is Q1. This is October. almost nothing new happens in the start of the fiscal year anyway, because so accustomed to having a CR to start the fiscal year. So we probably haven't fallen as far behind in this October as agencies did in January of 2019.
When you talk to folks after that shutdown, did you get any input from them about things that happened that they didn't anticipate, that were total surprises, and that they were not prepared to have to deal with when they came back, David?
We did, and there's three really important ones that come to mind. Number one is that the typical way a contracting operation or a program office looks at preparing for a shutdown is they look at two things with respect to their contract. One is the money there? Is it fully funded? Because that's from prior year obligations, right? Or prior year appropriations. And if it is, contractors have an affirmative responsibility to keep working unless the government tells you to stop or something makes you stop. You can't get in the building, you can't access the data, et cetera, right? So that was the first thing, is they only looked at that. The second thing is they looked at the ceiling and the burn rate. So, if I got this amount of money and my ceiling is way bigger than that and my burn rate is pretty slow, I don't have to worry. Well, it turns out there are levels of detail that really did matter. I don't have any indication that contracting officers and program managers in September of this year did any better job looking at that next layer of detail than others did. What might fall into that? And this is something companies should be doing right now to be taking stock of. Are there deliverables that I've submitted? Nobody was there to accept them, so I couldn't move on to the next task. Be ready. Those should be top of mind when the door opens again. I'm ready to go on this next thing, right? Was there an option that was supposed to be exercised and there was nobody there to exercise the option? Is there a grace period for that option? There's a lot of things. Were there accelerated costs that might have occurred because you did keep working during the shutdown, and that have the burn rates changed, and so you're going to hit your ceiling faster? These are the kinds of things you can't expect the government to have looked at. In my experience, they don't look at that in preparing for it. They don't, as you know, they don't really prepare. They want to pretend it's not going to happen until bam, the day it does, right? So companies need to get ready now for those kinds of conversations with their customers when it reopens.
Do you have concerns about the broader long-term implications of this shutdown being as long as it is, the last shutdown being as long as it was, for what it means for the industrial base, not just the DIB, for the Defense Department and the national security community, but more broadly for the federal government as a whole, David?
That's a really serious issue, Francis, and I think it's a little early to tell, but there's two things I'm concerned about there. One is that in our business today, and I've been in this business a long, long time. I was actually around before we had a FAR, right? When we were consolidating the defense acquisition regulation into the federal acquisition regulation. By the way, DOD did a good job of making sure they had primacy in that process. I'm not sure it'll come out that way this time, but that's a subject for a later conversation.
Yes.
The role of the financial marketplace in the defense industrial base and in the broader government business base is so much different now than it was in the 80s, the 90s, even the early aughts and the early teens. Money needs to make money, right? And one of the most powerful attributes the government has is it pays its bills on time. So that, and this has been true for our whole career, a government invoice is as good as cash in the financial marketplace. That has been undermined a little bit, both by slow paying during the shutdown and, of course, by things that happened before the shutdown, contract terminations, not paying invoices for work that was done under the prior administration, that sort of thing. So I'm watching very closely to see whether that impact has eroded some of the trust and value that a government invoice has in the financial marketplace. So that's the first one.
Quick sidebar, and you can deflect if you want to, and we'll keep talking about the shutdown because I didn't think about this ahead of time, but what do you make of the FAR overhaul? It strikes me that it's potentially going to make a huge difference in the way the government buys for a really, really, really long time. And so having your view of this from the very beginning, I think, is really instructive, David.
I've got 4 points to make there, and I'm just making them up off the top of my head because you're right, I didn't prepare for that. But number one is that all of the parts were rewritten. But as I've been reading the rewrites as they've come out, they have yet to be fully integrated. So that integration is a really important step that's going to be occurring now. The second is that I don't believe that the timetables for responses have been affected at all by the shutdown. I do believe that the dealing with the responses has been affected by the shutdown. So I'm not quite sure how to square that knot, if you will, or how to untie that knot where, the input that has to come from us on the outside is on the same timetable, and the ability to deal with that input has been slowed down. The third is that you're right. Inherent in a lot of this rewrite are some fundamentally different approaches to how the government buys. And I mentioned one of them already. It may not be a linear, we set the requirements, you tell us what you can be. It may be you tell us what you can do, and we'll make that the requirement if that's what we need, right? And that's a whole new dynamic. And then the fourth is there are lots and lots of impacts in various segments. For example, small business is going to be very different under the revised FAR than it has been in the past. And I don't really have a good sense yet of how that's going to affect either individual companies or the ability of the government to get its work done. And actually, a fifth point occurs to me even as we're looking at this here. The movement of a lot of what was previously regulation into guidance documents has a great plus because you can keep them current and you don't have to go back and redo the regs. But it also has a negative. You won't know what's changed and when. And you don't know as a contractor what your contracting officer has been changed on. A lot will fall to the companies to explain to the government what it is they can actually do and not do under this new FAR. And companies are going to have to be ready for that. And right now they're not.
All right, back to the shutdown. One of the things I remember about a conversation you and I had on TV after that shutdown, or maybe it was right close to the end of it, is you said that the reopening presented an opportunity both for the government and for the contracting base. Do you see that same possibility this time for this to be used in any way possible, for this to be an opportunity for good to come out of it, David?
I remember saying that then. Well, it's a different world now, Francis. Yeah. I think it's uneven. I think there are going to be places where that's clearly going to be true. One of the most important dynamics and rarely discussed of a shutdown like this is when the government stops doing something, people don't immediately miss it, right? Because so much of what the government does has a whole series of things that have to happen before it has an impact and shows up on your internet somewhere with data that you can use, right? And so that not missing the government right away, I think gives an opportunity to focus on something that I believe is really important to this administration, and it's really important to the future of America. And that is focusing on results rather than input. And if in fact you don't miss, if the input, missing the input doesn't change the output or doesn't change your view of the output, you got to rethink what are the results we're really trying to achieve here. And I do believe that companies have an opportunity, not necessarily on day one of the reopening, but as this falls out over the coming months, particularly with an FY26 budget that may well be another CR, right? How do I get more and better results in less time with the money and programs that I have? And that's something I think companies will have the opportunity to make that case more than they have had in the past. And I would advise companies to begin looking at that with respect to the customers that they know well in particular. Francis, the government counts on companies understanding their business in some cases as well or better than they do, especially the details. Take advantage of that. Tell them what the results are you think can be gotten out of this and how you can help them deliver on those results. We've seen GSA appeal for that from a number of companies. And so I think it's a springboard for an opportunity there. Thank you for asking that question. It's really making me think. You always make me think.
I love having you on the show. You do the same for me, my friend. It's great to have you here today. Thanks for joining me.
All right. My pleasure. And let's get on with this. Let's get back to work.
You can read more about the contracting landscape post-shutdown on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. The FedGov Today podcast is back tomorrow. What will federal government cyber professionals be up against when the shutdown ends and everybody comes back to work? Former federal Chief Information Security Officer Greg Toohill will tell you on tomorrow's FedGov Today podcast. If you don't want to miss that, you can follow the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, on the FedGov Today YouTube channel, or on demand at fedgovtoday.com. I'm Francis Rose. I'll talk to you then. Thanks for listening.